My husband stole all my savings and then kicked me out of the house. I was left with nothing. But a year later, I got every dollar back and took his property, and now he sleeps on a park bench. Stay with us until the very end to find out how the story ends. We look forward to your comments and thoughts on the story. When I married Tom, I sincerely believed that our union would last a lifetime. We were together for over 20 years. I worked as an accountant, saved money, and managed all the family finances while he built his auto repair shop. We lived modestly but steadily. My daily work, both at the office and at home, helped us get on our feet. The house we lived in was registered in both our names. Or so I thought. It all started imperceptibly. Tom began staying late at work. I didn't think much of it, putting it down to fatigue. Then he became colder, not angry, no, just indifferent. He stopped asking how I was, stopped sharing his day with me. I became a shadow in my own home. But the real blow wasn't his distant gaze. It was a letter from the bank. I saw it by accident. The envelope was lying on the table, and curiosity mixed with anxiety overcame my good manners. It was a document about a large withdrawal from our joint account. Money I had been saving for years. He had withdrawn everything, and he didn't say a word. I went to see him that same evening. I met him at the door, looking tired and carrying a bag from the supermarket. I handed him the paper, and all I heard in response was, "It's all legal. It was my business, my investments. You were just keeping it safe." And 2 days later, he kicked me out of the house. No drama, no shouting. He just left a suitcase with my things on the doorstep. It turned out that while I was at work, he had transferred the house into his name. Quietly, calmly, without any fuss, just for himself. I stood on the street, confused, with a couple of bags and a blank stare. I was 54. I had no apartment, no savings. Only memories and pain. But I didn't cry. I left silently and vowed to myself that I would return. Not for revenge. For justice. To prove that I couldn't be broken, even if I had to start from scratch. I woke up that day not from the light coming through the blinds or the smell of coffee, as it used to be, but from a draft blowing across the floor of the shelter where I was temporarily living. Everything was foreign: the bed, the smell, the sounds. It felt like I was inside another woman's life. Only now this strange life was mine. I didn't cry. I couldn't. It seemed that my tears had dried up that evening when Harold, with a cold expression on his face, threw me out the door with 2 bags and a look of contempt. He didn't shout or accuse me. He just said, "I don't need you anymore," and closed the door, as if I were something he had wanted to throw away for a long time, like a dusty rag. At the shelter, I tried to keep to myself. Not because I was ashamed, no. More because I didn't want to be like the others. I wasn't broken. I was temporarily deflated. I needed time to become myself again. To gather the pieces, not to rebuild what was before, but to build something new. Strong. Careful, determined. I got a job at a laundromat. The work was hard, but honest. I received my first paycheck a week later, $63.40. I counted the money as if it were treasure, because it was the first money I had earned after being betrayed. The first step toward independence. When Harold took everything away from me, he didn't know one thing: I wasn't going to stay down. I am a woman who knows how to endure, but I am even better at getting what is mine. Not with revenge, but with persistence. Not with anger, but with composure. Every evening when I came home from work, I wrote everything down: how much I spent, how much I saved. I started a notebook called The Comeback Plan. It had everything: step-by-step instructions, lawyers' phone numbers, deadlines, options for side jobs. It became my second Bible. While he was driving around in his new SUV, probably bought with my money, I was washing other people's sheets, rebuilding my life from scratch. Day after day, dollar after dollar. Not in the hope of returning to the past. No, I no longer needed that past. I wanted to build a future in which he was just a name in my memory. And then, one evening, I saw him. He was standing outside a shopping center talking on the phone. Happy, carefree, as if everything he had done was nothing. And then I knew it was time to move on to the next step of my plan, because he had no idea that I hadn't just survived. I was going to win. I stared at him through the glass window of the supermarket for a long time. Harold was standing by the shelf with expensive cheeses, trying to decide what to get. He was wearing the coat we once bought together in Boston. I remember how he grumbled about the price and then said, "But if you think it suits me, go ahead and get it." He knew how to be charming. He knew how to envelop you like a warm blanket. But under that blanket was ice. I walked away before he could notice me. I didn't meet a show. My return wasn't supposed to be loud. It was supposed to be precise. I went home, made tea, sat down at the table, and laid out the papers in front of me. In the top drawer of my nightstand were copies of all the documents I had begun to collect: bank statements, joint accounts, equity investments, notes from my lawyer, proof of money transfers. He thought I was naive. He thought I had left everything behind. But I'm not just a wife, I'm an accountant by training. I knew where my money was going. I knew I could prove it. In the morning, I went to a free legal consultation. The woman at the desk listened carefully to my story, leafed through the papers, and the more she listened, the straighter her back became. At one point, she put the documents aside, looked at me, and said, "You have a chance. A real one. It will take time, but you can file a lawsuit. You can get everything back." I left feeling like I had taken a deep breath for the first time in a year. The sky above me seemed brighter than usual. The city didn't seem so hostile. It was the beginning. Since then, I've been living on a schedule: work, a part-time job at a cafe in the evenings, meetings with lawyers, paperwork, trips to court. I lived like a machine, driven by one thought: I don't just want justice. I deserve it. And I will get it. Sometimes I was scared. Sometimes I had doubts. What if it doesn't work out? What if he gets out of it? What if I spend everything and end up with nothing? But at times like that, I would take out a photograph, an old, yellowed one of me, 20 years old, in a worn shirt, standing at the doorstep of the first house Harold and I bought. On the back was his handwriting: "You did the impossible." I had always done the impossible, and now was no exception. 3 months later, I received notice that a preliminary hearing had been scheduled. My lawyer called me and said, "Get ready. He won't be happy, but you need to stay calm. You will speak like a woman who has had everything taken away from her and who knows how to get it back." And that evening, I stared at myself in the mirror for a long time. At the wrinkles, at the gray hair at my temples, at my thin lips, pressed together with tension. I'm not young, I'm not perfect, but I'm strong. I'm someone who comes back not with pleas, but with proof. Not with anger, but with the truth. The courthouse greeted me with the smell of polished wood, the whispers of people in the waiting room, and that special chill that always lives where other people's fates are decided. I arrived early, wearing a strict suit, my hair neatly combed, and carrying a folder that contained my entire past year. As I sat on a bench by the door to the hall, my fingers clenched the handle tightly, as if it could give me support. When Harold entered, I felt it not even with my eyes, but with my skin. He was not alone. Next to him was a young woman, about 20 years younger, in a short skirt and with a confident gait. She held his arm, as if to remind me, I am here now. He noticed me and raised his eyebrows. He smiled. He even winked. It was as if we had met by chance in a shopping mall, not in a courtroom. "Mrs. Taylor, are you ready?" My lawyer snapped me out of my stupor. I nodded. We entered the courtroom. He sat on one side, I sat on the other. The judge was stern, barely looking up. He recited the standard opening remarks and gave the parties the floor. Harold listened to me with his arms crossed over his chest. He was confident of his impunity, as if it were all just a game. But now I was the one playing, and I was writing the rules. My lawyer laid out the documents, explaining step by step how, over the course of 2 years, Harold had withdrawn money from our joint accounts and transferred it to personal accounts registered to front men. How he sold our house behind my back. How he withdrew my retirement savings, taking advantage of my trust. How he manipulated documents, taking advantage of the fact that I was convinced at the time that marriage was all about trust. And how, in the end, he kicked me out, leaving everything for himself. Harold began to lose his composure. He interrupted, smirked, and pretended that it was all ridiculous. But the judge looked at him more sternly, especially when we presented letters and audio recordings of phone calls in which he openly admitted that he was tired of feeding his unemployed wife. When the hearing was over, he jumped up to me at the exit. "You let it all go," he hissed. "What do you want now?" I looked at him calmly. "I just want back what you stole from me, Harold. That's all." He recoiled as if I had hit him. I turned and walked out into the street. It was a cold but sunny day. I walked slowly, feeling something inside me that I had been afraid of losing forever begin to come back to life. Confidence, calmness, strength. It was only the first hearing. There was a long road ahead. But now he knew I was back. I was not a victim. I was a woman who had started a new game. And I was not going to lose anymore. Every new day now began with the same thing: a cup of strong tea, an open window that smelled of autumn and smoke, and a long list of tasks that I had made for myself. I lived in a rented apartment, small, with a worn carpet and creaky doors, but in this apartment, my voice could be heard again. I wasn't bothering anyone. I didn't have to explain to anyone why I forgot to buy milk or why dinner wasn't ready. And in this silence, for the first time in a long time, I began to hear myself again. The process dragged on. Harold's lawyers stalled for time, made up stories, tried to provoke me. He filed a counterclaim, claiming that I had voluntarily renounced all joint assets, that I had agreed to an amicable separation, that I had been living off him. I expected this, but deep down, it still hurt. After all, we had been together for 21 years. We had built a business together, built a house, and cared for his mother together during her final months. And now I was just a burden to him. But I didn't let that stop me. I had a case. And in that case, I was the chief witness, lawyer, and judge of myself. I worked 2 shifts during the day at a bookstore and in the evening cleaning a neighboring office. I saved every penny. It was hard, very hard. But I trained myself to think that every dollar was a step closer to justice. To freedom. Once a week, I met with my lawyer. We sat in her office, surrounded by files, and planned our next strategy. I brought her screenshots, bank statements, even photographs. Everything I could find. I became my own investigator. And she looked at me with respect, the kind of respect no one had shown me in years. That feeling of being heard, understood, was healing. One evening, after cleaning the office, I stopped at the bus stop and saw a man sleeping on a bench. He was wrapped in a coat, his face hidden by a scarf. I approached him to give him a small bag of food. I often left snacks for the homeless. The man raised his head and I froze. It wasn't Harold, of course, but he looked a lot like him. And at that moment, I suddenly realized that deep down, I still didn't want him to suffer. I wanted him to understand. Not forgiveness, but at least an understanding of what he had done. But that didn't change my goal. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was regaining my balance. The trial was set for January. There were 2 months left, and I lived like a soldier waiting for battle, calm, on schedule, without unnecessary emotions. I started walking again, joined the library, and sometimes watched movies on an old laptop. It wasn't luxurious, but it wasn't desperate either. Most importantly, I was no longer afraid. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't suffering. I was preparing for my return. And with each passing day, I felt that I had already regained not only half of my money, but also myself. I remember that evening clearly. It was snowing lightly, the streets were almost empty, and the city seemed to be holding its breath. I was returning home from work, holding a loaf of bread and a bottle of cheap wine, a small reward for another week gone by. At the intersection, right in front of the old cafe, I saw them. Harold and his new girlfriend. They were sitting in the window. She was saying something, waving her arms. He was looking at her with a tired, irritated expression. His face was gaunt, his gaze heavy, like a man who had realized too early that he had traded stability for an illusion. I stopped, not out of curiosity, but rather out of an observer's interest. I no longer felt pain or betrayal. I watched like a stranger on a stage that had once been part of my life. Now it wasn't. He noticed me. I didn't turn away or quicken my pace. Our eyes met. I nodded slightly and walked away. I don't know what he felt, but what I felt was liberation. The trial was approaching. Everything was becoming more real. We gathered documents, witnesses, statements from former employees, even old letters in which Harold himself admitted that the business was mainly based on my ideas and management. I remembered how he once told his friends, without her, everything would fall apart. At the time, it seemed romantic. Now it was proof. My lawyer looked at me with increasing respect. At one of our meetings, she said, "You have no idea how rare it is for women to do this. Most give up. But you didn't give up." And I suddenly realized that in this process, I wasn't just seeking justice in court, I was rebuilding myself, brick by brick, without a foundation, without a plan, but with willpower. I didn't tell any of my old friends what was going on. Those who used to call us the perfect couple disappeared immediately after the divorce. Some even sided with Harold. I didn't care. Those who really know you don't disappear. I didn't owe the rest anything. With only a week left before the trial, I bought myself a new coat. It was inexpensive, but simple, warm, and flattering. It was a symbol. I was different. I wasn't broken, forgotten, or discarded. I was moving forward, and no one could stop me anymore. The story was still unfolding, but at that moment, I already knew that I would have the final say, because I would write it myself. The courthouse seemed particularly tall that day. Perhaps it was because I was not there simply as an ex-wife. I was there as a person who had been robbed of everything and who intended to reclaim every piece of the truth. I didn't come to seek revenge, but to put an end to it. An end that would mark the beginning of a new chapter. I stood at the door, my fingers trembling slightly, but inside I felt neither fear nor pain. Only cold determination. I was wearing my brand new coat, my hair was done, and my makeup was minimal but precise. I wanted the court to see not a victim, but a woman who could no longer be ignored. Harold showed up later. He was with a new companion, a woman about 10 years younger, wearing a short skirt and looking annoyed. She was smoking on the porch and looking at me as if I were a threat to her position. But it didn't bother me anymore. I looked past them. The hearing was long. The judge leafed through files, asked questions, and listened to us carefully. At first, Harold was confident, trying to talk about mutual obligations, household expenses, and how everything was fair. But when my lawyer pulled out old reports, bank statements, and letters, his face turned pale. Especially when we showed a video recording of one of his conversations with the accountant, where he says directly, "The money will go out of the account anyway. Let her not notice." I didn't look at him. I looked at the judge. Because the truth is more important than feelings. And I no longer allowed my emotions to dictate who I am. When the hearing ended, the judge did not deliver his verdict immediately. He said, "The case is too extensive. I will announce my decision in a week." I wasn't afraid. I knew we had done everything right. On the way home, I bought myself a cherry pie and custard. A small victory is still a victory. I lit a candle, poured myself some tea, and allowed myself to cry. Not from pain, from relief. I had made it. I hadn't broken down. I had stood in court opposite the man who had stolen my life, and I hadn't looked away. That week of waiting was strange. I lived as if in a pause between two acts. Everything had been done, said, signed. All that was left was to wait for that moment. And it came. The court's decision was scheduled for Monday morning. I woke up before dawn, even though my alarm hadn't gone off yet. My heart was beating steadily, but a little faster than usual, like someone who feels that change is coming. I made myself some oatmeal, brewed some coffee, and while I ate, I looked out the window at the street, where cars were already waking up. It was quiet, calm. Inside, it was almost the same. Almost. I arrived at the courtroom a little early. My lawyer was waiting for me at the entrance, calm and reserved, with her usual folder in her hands. She smiled at me. "You're doing great. Today we're closing the circle," she said. Harold appeared 5 minutes before the start. Without a companion. Alone. His face was tired, his eyes irritated. hidden behind a mask of indifference. He walked quickly past me without even glancing in my direction. The judge entered, and everyone stood up. He sat down, leafed through some papers, and began to speak calmly, monotonously, formally. But every word he said hit home. He acknowledged the fact of financial fraud, confirmed the right to compensation for all stolen funds, and ordered Harold to return to me part of the property registered to front men. The court also ordered compensation for moral damages, considering that I had been effectively deprived of my livelihood for a long time. My heart froze at first. Then it beat with a force I hadn't felt in a long time. I turned to my lawyer, and she nodded silently. We had won. Harold jumped up and started to say something, but the judge stopped him and warned him about contempt of court. He sat down, but his face said it all. He hadn't expected that the woman he once considered weak and helpless would be able to see the case through to the end. But I did. When it was over, I stepped outside and breathed in the air for the first time in a long time, as if I had just learned to breathe again. I was no longer the person who had been kicked out of her home. I was the one who had taken everything back. Every ounce of dignity, every dollar, every bit of self-belief. Later, I walked past the old park. I sat down on a bench. I watched the children playing ball, the teenagers laughing, the old people discussing the newspapers. And suddenly I realized I was back in my life, the one where I decide where to go and what to do next. I didn't know where Harold lived now. I didn't care. It didn't matter anymore. The main thing was that I was back on my feet, and those feet weren't going backward anymore, only forward. 2 days after the trial, I got access to my account. The numbers were modest, but they were mine. Legally mine. Every penny was a piece of my dignity back. I looked over the statements and smiled. Memories flashed through my mind of sitting in the kitchen with an empty refrigerator, counting every penny, putting off buying essentials for fear of running out of money. Now I looked at my balance and felt reborn. I rented an apartment. Small but cozy. White walls, warm light, the smell of fresh coffee, which I could now afford to brew in the mornings again. For the first time in a long time, I hung curtains, hung a picture, lit a candle. These little things that seemed like luxuries suddenly became symbols of a new beginning. Harold, he disappeared. Sometimes former acquaintances would call me and say they had seen him in temporary shelters, that he had lost his home, that his new girlfriend had left him when she found out there would be no more money. But I didn't react. It wasn't my victory. My victory was that I was no longer part of his story. I was writing mine. On one of my walks, I ran into Sarah, an old friend I had lost touch with after my divorce. She approached me uncertainly, but with warmth in her voice. I heard what you went through. You look amazing. You held on like a heroine. I smiled. I accepted her apology without words. We had coffee, talked, and I laughed genuinely for the first time in a long time. Life was coming back. Later, I decided to enroll in interior design classes. It had once been my hobby, now I wanted to make it my job. I wasn't going to depend on other people's decisions anymore. I knew my worth, and if anyone dared to forget that again, I would remind them. But not with words, with my life. In the evenings, I sat by the window, drank tea, looked at the city lights, and thanked myself for not giving up, for standing my ground, for not letting one betrayal ruin the rest of my life. Autumn came quickly. The wind grew cooler, the leaves on the trees turned orange and gold, and my world became peaceful. For the first time in a long time, my apartment felt cozy, not just because of the decor, but because my soul was light. I got up early, made coffee, turned on the music, and sat at my laptop, taking my first steps in the world of design. The courses were going well. The teacher, a woman my age, immediately noticed my desire, not fake, but real. She said once, "You don't just have taste. You have a story behind your eyes." I can feel it. I just nodded. Because it was true, every color, every accent, every shadow now meant more to me. I knew how important home was. Not the walls, but what was inside. I had lost it once, but now I was building it again. From scratch. And in my own way. One day after class, I was walking home when I saw a man sleeping on a bench at the entrance to my building. He was wrapped in an old coat with a worn bag under his head. It was dark, the streetlight was flickering, but I recognized him immediately. It was Harold, my ex-husband, the man who once cut me out of his life and then tried to cut me out of mine. He was lying there, curled up, as if the world had become too cold. And at that moment, I felt neither anger nor joy, only silence, just emptiness. I slowly walked past him. He didn't wake up, or he pretended not to recognize me. And I didn't stop. This wasn't my path anymore, not my life, not my man. He chose how to fill it himself. At home, I turned on the lamp, opened a book, but couldn't read. His face was before my eyes. The face of a man who had lost everything, not by accident, but by choice. He made those choices one after another. And now he was on a bench. And I was in my apartment, in my place, with a cup of tea and my own future. I didn't feel sorry for him, but I wasn't happy either. I just remembered, so that I would never forget how important it is to be on your own side. The next day, I woke up with a heavy feeling inside. The image of Harold on that bench wouldn't leave me, no matter how hard I tried to focus on my work. He was the backdrop to everything: my laptop screen, my cup of coffee, my view out the window. I kept returning in my mind to his hunched figure, and there was something unnatural about it, seeing a defeated man you once loved. I didn't want to feel sorry for him. I wanted to forget. But you can't negotiate with memory. I went to a course to try to take my mind off things. We were working on a project for a charity, and there was something very personal about it: a home for women who had experienced loss, betrayal, and pain. Every detail of the space had to say, "You're not alone." When I suggested putting a large mirror in the hallway with the words, "You're still here, and that matters," written on it, the teacher just looked at me and said, "That's why you're doing this. Your heart knows how to speak through things." After class, I went to a small cafe on the corner and ordered apple pie and coffee, my autumn combo, as I called it. A woman in her 70s was sitting at the next table. She smiled at me, and we suddenly struck up a conversation. I don't remember how we started. Maybe it was the weather or the smell of cinnamon, but soon she was telling me about her husband, who had died 20 years ago, and how hard it was to learn to live again. "You don't know how strong you are until you're alone," she said. I nodded, not knowing whether to tell her what I had been through. And then I realized I didn't need to tell her anymore. It was in the past. Not a scar, an experience. Later, when I returned home, the bench was empty. Harold was gone. And I felt relieved, not because he was gone, but because I wasn't expecting him to be there. Everything inside me let go. No chains. No unspoken words. Just me, my road, and the wind, which no longer sounded alarming. I went into the house, took off my coat, poured myself some tea, and opened my laptop. I had a new idea, a design for a space for a single woman starting over. A space where there was no fear. Where everything was a reminder. You made it. You're home again. With each passing day, my life looked less like ruins and more like a home. A real one. Not everything was settled yet, but the main thing was that I was finally living by my own rules. And to my surprise, I began to notice that the world was responding to this too. I started getting my first private commissions. They were small consultations, decor selection, help with bedroom colors, or furniture placement. But I saw each one as a victory. People trusted me, not just as a designer, but as a woman who knows how important it is for a home to be a source of support. One day, a woman named Linda called me. Her voice trembled as she told me that after her divorce, she was afraid to return to her apartment. Everything there reminded her of her husband. I listened to her and heard myself, the person I used to be. Every word resonated inside me, as if I were saying it to someone a year ago. I agreed to help. When I arrived at Linda's place, she greeted me with a forced smile and eyes full of sadness. The room really was like a museum of her former life. Nothing had changed, as if she was afraid to touch the present. I spent 3 days at her apartment. We worked together, sorting through things, repainting walls, adding textiles and lighting. But the most important thing that happened was our conversations. We talked while we repapered the walls, drank tea among the boxes, and arranged books on the shelves. I didn't think I'd ever be able to sleep peacefully again, she said as we parted. But now I know it's possible. I left with the feeling that I wasn't just doing my job. I was doing what I seemed to have been born to do, helping others escape the darkness I had escaped myself. Without pity, without grand words. I just turn on the light in people's homes. And in people themselves. Later that night, I walked past that same bench again. It had been empty for many days. But inside me, there was still a trace, not of Harold, but of the path I had traveled. I no longer looked for him or wondered what had become of him. I no longer asked myself why, because I knew that, having survived one betrayal, I had not betrayed myself. And that was the main thing. The snow fell unexpectedly early this year. The morning was quiet, white as a clean sheet on which you want to start all over again. I looked out the window, holding a hot cup of coffee in my hands, and caught myself thinking that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the future. There was no anxious anticipation, no fear that the ground would disappear from under my feet again. There was only one feeling: I was living the way I wanted to, and that was priceless. The phone rang. It was Sarah, a friend I lost in the divorce. The same one who chose not to get involved when Harold kicked me out of the house. She said, "I don't want to take sides." But silence in situations like this is also a choice. "Hi," she said uncertainly. "I heard. Harold has really hit rock bottom. They say he's sleeping wherever he can and looks terrible." "I'm sorry, I didn't know things were so difficult." I didn't say anything. I had long since forgiven her for her silence, but I hadn't forgotten it. Because when you're going through a hard time, it's especially important who is there for you and who looks away. "Do you want to visit him?" she asked. I smiled, not out of anger, but out of surprise. How strange people are. We live each other's lives for years and then suddenly remember that everyone had a choice. "No," I replied calmly. "I don't want to. That's not my path." After the conversation, I sat in silence for a long time. I looked at my hands. These hands that a year ago were trembling as they packed up a life into boxes. These hands that now created comfort, drew sketches, and brought warmth to other people's apartments. These hands pulled me out of the abyss. I had someone to thank myself. That same day, I got a call from a design competition. My project, Home After the Storm, a cozy space for women starting their lives over, had made it to the finals. I was going to have to give a speech and tell my story. I was nervous, but I wasn't afraid, because now I had something to say. On stage, I didn't talk about divorce. I didn't talk about pain. I talked about home as a metaphor for women. Sometimes it gets destroyed. Sometimes the windows are broken, the lights are turned off, and everything valuable is taken away. But if you give it a chance, if you're not afraid to start over, you can build something much stronger. Something real. After the performance, several women approached me. Their eyes were filled with tears and light at the same time. "You said what I couldn't put into words," one whispered. "Thank you." And then I realized I had already won. Not over Harold. Not over those who turned away. Over myself. I had defeated that broken, frightened woman who once stood on the threshold of an empty house. I was back. Stronger than I had been before. That evening, when I returned home after the conference where I had talked about my project, I didn't want to talk to anyone. Not because I was tired, on the contrary. I had too many feelings that I wanted to experience in silence. I lit a candle on the windowsill, put on a jazz record, and sat down in an armchair by the window, wrapped in a woolen blanket. It was quiet inside. Not joyful in the usual sense, but deeply, maturely calm. I leafed through the notebook where I had been writing down everything important this year. Quotes, thoughts, small victories. And suddenly I came across a line I had written on the very first night Harold kicked me out of the house. Back then I wrote, "It hurts now. But one day I'll wake up in my own home and realize that this was the beginning of something great." I read it and smiled, because now I knew that's exactly what happened. The next day, I went about my business. I had to meet with a client, then stop by the fabric store. And just as I was leaving the mall, someone called my name. "Maggie?" I turned around. Standing in front of me was Dan, an old friend of Harold's and mine. We hadn't seen each other in 10 years. He hadn't changed much, except for a few gray hairs. His gaze was as warm as ever. "I didn't expect to see you." "You," he faltered, "look very well." We talked for a few minutes, and he suggested we get some coffee. I didn't mind. We sat in a small coffee shop, and to my surprise, I found myself laughing. From the heart. Easily. "I heard that things didn't work out for you," he said cautiously. "Harold seems to have completely lost himself. I regret not writing to you back then. You didn't deserve what happened." "It's okay," I replied. "You know, sometimes you have to go through fire to feel that you're real." He nodded. And then he asked, "Would you like to just go to the theater sometime?" And I suddenly realized that I wasn't afraid of the idea. I wasn't living in the past anymore. I wasn't comparing, I wasn't looking for a catch. I just felt that I was ready. "I'd love to," I replied. "Just no tragedies. Let it be something lighthearted." We agreed to meet on the weekend. On my way home, I didn't think about Harold or the past or the pain. I thought about a dress I hadn't worn in a long time and how beautiful life can be when you don't cling to the pieces of what you've lost. I spent a long time choosing what to wear. The theater wasn't the most important event in my life, but inside I was trembling, not from fear, no, from unfamiliar excitement. It had been a long time since I had felt like a woman who wanted to be liked. Not for someone else's sake, but for my own. I settled on a burgundy dress that I had kept from the days when Harold and I were still dating. It still fit me perfectly, only now I wasn't someone's wife in it, but myself. Dan arrived on time. He didn't shower me with compliments. He just looked at me and said, "You are a very dignified woman. You can see that from the moment you walk in the room." We sat in a small theater on an old street. I listened to the actors, and, to be honest, I didn't remember a single line. All my attention was somewhere inside me. I watched myself, how easily I smiled, how my shoulders didn't tense up, how I didn't want to be smaller, quieter, more comfortable. Everything I used to do around Harold. After the play, we walked home. We walked slowly, as if we didn't want the evening to end. Dan wasn't just attentive. He knew how to listen. And he wasn't afraid of silence. "You've changed," he said suddenly. "You used to be in a hurry all the time. Now you seem more grounded. You're different." I stopped. I looked him straight in the eyes. "I'm not different. I'm real. I just didn't know myself before." He nodded silently. And then I realized I didn't have to prove anything. Not to him, not to anyone else. I wasn't looking for a man. I was looking for myself. And now that I had found myself, I could allow myself to share, but not lose myself again. That night, I returned home and suddenly realized I am happy. Not because of a man, not because of my successes, but because I no longer live in fear. I am not waiting for someone to come and save me. I have already saved myself. And let Harold sleep on a park bench now, let all his control turn out to be empty. I don't need revenge. It's enough for me to know that I got out. I'm alive. With each passing day, I felt more and more clearly that my life was slowly but surely coming together. It was like a puzzle that had been missing important pieces for a long time and was now suddenly coming together into a complete picture. In the morning, I woke up not with anxiety, as I had before, but with the feeling that the day would be mine, without fear, without a struggle for survival, without someone's shadow hanging over me. I signed the papers for a small studio, which I opened near where I now lived. There I worked with textiles, took orders, and sometimes gave master classes myself. People began to come not only for work, they wanted to talk, to listen, to share. Some talked about divorce, others about the age at which they suddenly lost their footing. I wasn't a therapist to them, but I think they felt that I understood. One evening, as I was closing the studio and walking home, there was a homeless man with a dog standing on the corner. I had seen him before, just briefly. But this time, when he looked up, I froze. Harold. He didn't recognize me right away. Or maybe he didn't want to. He was wearing a dark jacket, unshaven, with empty eyes. Our eyes met. For a moment. He looked away. I didn't go over. I didn't say a word. Not out of spite, I just didn't need to. It had already happened. I stood a little to the side, watching the once confident man now begging for change from passers-by. Not with triumph, but with the realization that everything comes back, and everything has consequences. I returned home and, for the first time in a long time, wrote in my diary not about pain or struggle, but about peace. About how victory isn't when you outrun someone, but when you stop living in the past. I was no longer angry with him. He made his own choice. And I made mine. And most importantly, I didn't want to go back. Not even for a second. Now my future was mine alone. No more dependence, no more manipulation, no more role that had once been forced upon me. I was a woman who had survived. But not only that, I was a woman who had learned to live again. That morning, I woke up feeling like I had wings behind my back. It wasn't because of anything special. It was just that the day began with silence, with morning coffee by the window, with light breathing. I hadn't felt truly free in so long that now I couldn't even believe it myself. I no longer owed anything to anyone. I put on a light beige shirt, did my hair, and applied a little eye makeup, not for anyone else, but for myself. I wanted to be beautiful. I wanted to like my reflection. That day, a young woman came to my studio. She stood at the window for a long time, then entered uncertainly. "Are you Evelyn?" she asked. "Yes. How can I help you?" She was pale, thin, with a quiet voice, and with pain in her eyes that I recognized immediately. The pain of those who find themselves on the sidelines of their own lives. I heard you help women," she said. "Not just with interior design. In general. To get myself back." That phrase sent a chill down my spine. I nodded. We talked for a long time, and I listened to her story, similar to mine, and yet different. A husband who controlled her, made promises, played with her feelings, and the emptiness she was left with. I didn't say anything dramatic. I just looked at her with the calmness that comes after a storm. "You were at rock bottom too, weren't you?" she asked quietly. "I was," I said. And if someone had told me then that one day I would be sitting here like this, in my own space, with people who trust me, I wouldn't have believed them. But here I am. And you can too. When she left, I sat there alone for a long time. And suddenly I realized that everything I had gone through, all the humiliation, betrayal, and loneliness, had not been in vain. I hadn't just gotten out, I had become something bigger. A source. A point of support. A light that others needed. And at that moment, I thought of Harold again. Where was he now? On the same bench? Was he trying to change something? Or was he still a prisoner of himself? I didn't know. And maybe I never would. But I didn't want to know anymore. I was free. A woman was standing at my doorstep. Tall, well-groomed, with a confident gaze and an expensive raincoat. I recognized her immediately. It was his new girlfriend. The one for whom Harold had once thrown me out of his life, like a piece of old, useless furniture. "Hello," she said coldly. "Are you Evelyn?" "Yes, that's me," I replied calmly. "And you are?" "I'm Leslie. Or rather, I was. I lived with Harold. Until recently." I stepped aside silently, inviting her in. But she didn't move. She just pressed her lips together, as if gathering her courage. "He hates you," she said finally. "Every evening. Every night. He can't forget that you're successful now. That you made it." I just nodded. "And I came because I wanted to understand. How did you do it? How did you not break?" Her voice was breaking, but there was no threat in it. Only fatigue. A woman's fatigue. The kind I knew with every fiber of my being. I moved closer, gently, without contempt, without malice. "He didn't just break me," I said quietly. "He broke everything he touched. But I'm not a piece of furniture. I'm a person. And I've learned to pick myself up piece by piece." She turned away. I could see her shoulders shaking. "Is he still with you?" I asked. "No. He disappeared. Again. He took the money, the car, and then he was gone." She looked up at me. "I don't know why I'm telling you this, but you're the only one who will understand." I didn't know what to say. I just stood there. A woman who had once been betrayed, standing in front of a woman who was next on the list. "If he shows up," she said finally, "I'll tell him, you lost everything not because the world is unfair. It's because you destroyed everything yourself. When she left, I felt uneasy. Not out of anger, but out of a strange, deep, familiar sadness. I knew the path she had to take, and I knew she had to walk it alone. But on that day, I realized the most important thing. My past had not returned to destroy me again. It had come so that I could finally let go. It all started with a letter. A real paper letter with sweeping handwriting that I hadn't seen in over 10 years. It came with no return address in a plain envelope, and it smelled of rain and tobacco. Evelyn, you probably thought I disappeared, that you would never see me again. But I'm alive. I'm not sure if you're happy to hear that. I've realized a lot. Too late, as usual. I was an idiot. Not just a coward, but selfish to the core. I destroyed you, and I thought I'd get away with it. Then you left, and for the first time, I understood what it was like to be alone. I don't need your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But if you ever think of me again, let it be without pain. Just as a person you once loved. I reread the letter many times. My fingers trembled, but not with anger. Not from fear, but from something deeper, the emptiness that I thought I had filled long ago. He was still alive, and he seemed to be somewhere nearby. The next morning, I saw him. He was sitting on a bench near my studio in the shade of the trees. I noticed him right away, thinner, with gray temples and a look that no longer hid behind a mask of self-confidence. This wasn't the Harold I remembered. This was a man tired of living in his own shadow. He stood up when I approached, slowly, as if each step was difficult. But he didn't say a word. He just looked me in the eyes. "You got everything you wanted," I said quietly, "but you lost everything that was real." He nodded. No excuses. No words. "I don't wish you any harm," I added, "but don't ask for my forgiveness. You don't need it anymore." I turned and walked away, with my head held high. At that moment, I realized that my life was no longer connected to the past, even if it continued to haunt the streets around me. I had been through everything. I had survived, and now I was living. A week had passed since that morning when I saw Harold on the bench. He hadn't shown up again. No letters, no glances from afar, no chance encounters. And I was beginning to believe that his return was just an episode, the last shadow from which I had finally managed to free myself. But one day, the phone rang in the studio. The secretary handed me the receiver with a quiet, "Mr. B's lawyer is on the line. He says it's important." I frowned but picked up the phone. "Miss Evelyn, good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Reyes. I represent your former husband, Mr. Harold B. He left a document at the bank which, at his request, must be given to you, regardless of your future contact with him." "A document?" I asked suspiciously. "A will. Quite unexpected. He asks that you open it only in person, in the presence of a notary." He insisted on this. My heart skipped a beat. A will? It was all so strange that I went to the meeting. I sat in the notary's office with my fingers trembling. Jonathan laid out the papers, opened one of the envelopes, and began to read aloud. "I, Harold B., being of sound mind and sober memory, bequeath all that I have on the day this will is opened to Evelyn Rose, the woman I betrayed, destroyed, and, as it turns out, loved all my life. I ask for nothing in return. No words, no answers, not even a glance. This is an attempt to give back, in some small way, what I took away. It is my last chance to be a man, at least on paper." I sat in complete silence. There was a small bill, an old piece of land in Nevada, a car that I recognized, the one he had once bought with my money, and a note. Written in pen, in uneven handwriting, "You saved yourself. Now forgive yourself. I still believed in you more than I believed in myself. Harold." I didn't cry. I just stared out the window at the light rain falling behind the glass. Not tears, purification. He gave me everything, but I didn't need it anymore. Not because it was insignificant, but because I had long since learned to live without him. I left the notary's office holding a thin folder. Inside was everything he had left me: a plot of land, bills, a car, a couple of yellowed papers. Perhaps for some, this would have been a source of satisfaction, a small victory. But for me, it no longer had any value. I felt no joy, no triumph, no feeling that life had put everything in its place. Rather, silence. Deep, like after a long rain. I walked for a long time, as if giving myself time to digest everything. I stopped in the park, where the bench used to be. It was empty. I thought how strange life was. Harold was my downfall, my wound, and at some point, my rebirth. Without him, I would never have become so strong. I wouldn't have opened my studio, risen from the ashes. But I also didn't forgive him. And most importantly, I didn't go back. Late at night, I sat at home at my desk, sorting through papers. In the envelope with the will, I found a small old album. At first, I didn't pay any attention to it. But when I opened it, I saw photographs. Mine, my work, my portraits, old postcards with my drawings, even newspaper clippings where I was first mentioned as an artist. He had kept all of it, all these years. And on the last page was my portrait, drawn in charcoal, by his hand, clumsy with mistakes, but recognizable. My smile, my hair, and an inscription at the bottom. I lost her twice. First out of stupidity, then forever. I'm sorry, Evie. I closed the album. The tears finally came. Quietly. Not from pain, but from the realization that it was really over now. A new chapter lay ahead, and I was going to open it myself without looking back. A month after everything happened, I drove south, to the place where the piece of land Harold had indicated in his will was located. It was a place I knew nothing about, a lost piece of desert with an abandoned house and an overgrown garden. Nothing special. No amenities, no view, not even a decent road. But I was drawn there. It was as if part of me knew I had to see it for myself. The house was deserted, but inside, there was a box neatly placed on the table. Inside it were letters, more than 30 of them, signed with my name. He had written to me every month for 2.5 years. He never sent them. He just wrote them, folded them, and left them there. Today, I dreamed of your laughter. I woke up and sat in silence for a long time. I realized that nothing in this world sounded more beautiful to me. I saw your new painting in a magazine. You've gotten better without me. It hurts, but it's true. And I'm proud of you. I don't know why I'm still writing. Probably so I don't go crazy with regret. I read them all, one after another. And every line was like a breath of the past that could never be brought back. The house was cool, but not cold. I sat by the window and watched the sun slowly sink below the horizon. And for the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. My past was broken. My heart was healed. And in this abandoned house, I found not pain, but closure. I went out, locked the door, and left the key in the lock. Let it remain for those who come after me. This house was no longer his. It was no longer mine. It was the past that I had let go. When I got into the car, I realized that everything was over. Everything that needed to be said, heard, and felt had come to an end. The last step remained ahead of me. A year has passed. This morning, I opened my eyes not because of pain or memories, but simply because it was quiet and sunny. I got up, made coffee, and sat down by the window. My home has become bright and cozy. On the walls are paintings that I no longer paint for recognition, only for myself. The studio had been bringing in income for a long time, but the main thing was freedom. I no longer had anything to prove to anyone. Not to Harold. Not to the world. Not to myself. Sometimes passersby ask me, "Are you Evelyn Rose? The artist?"
I smile. I used to be. Now I'm just Evelyn. One day I saw him again. He was sitting at the same supermarket where I had bought water after the trial. He had gray hair and a hunched back, but his eyes were the same, confused, like a man who had once chosen the wrong path and didn't know how to get off it. He saw me. Our eyes met, and I nodded, not out of pity, not out of pride, but because now I didn't need revenge or regrets. I walked away without looking back. Now I knew. My story wasn't about how he took everything from me. It was about how I got everything back. And even more. I got myself back. And he stayed where he had once decided to stay. not because someone pushed him there, but because he couldn't bear that I had been able to do it without him. It was my victory, without shouting, without war, without destruction, a victory in silence.